You made me sound so great. Shabbat shalom, everyone. My name is Noah Letterman, and it's an honor to be here tonight. As was mentioned, I grew up in Orange County, California, which actually, while California itself may be, as was described, I grew up in a sort of very small community, and I went to a Jewish day school from kindergarten to 12th grade. So when I say I grew up in a bubble, I really meant it. I grew up in a bubble. Before October 7th, my only real exposure to any sort of anti-Semitism was two incidents. One where there was some graffiti on a local synagogue near my school, and then a few years later, there was an incident where some high school students at a neighboring high school arranged their solo cups in the form of a swastika, and I was part of both of the initiatives after that to sort of educate why this is so wrong and so hurtful, because these were both incidents that were done by students. So that was my sort of first taste for dealing with ignorance and lack of understanding. Now, however, anti-Semitism has practically become part of my daily life at Columbia and in New York. Last year as a freshman, it was my first year last year, I witnessed firsthand just how quickly anti-Semitism can become normalized, as the protesters went from initially saying pretty vague and ambiguous calls of from the river to the sea and sort of Palestine will be free, to saying go back to Europe, chasing us off campus and pointing at us and calling us Al-Qassam's next targets, Hamas's next targets. The anti-Semitism that I experienced firsthand at Columbia revealed to me just how important it is to fight back with education and engagement. I spoke out against those protesters who were trying to shame Jewish students for their religion or their Zionism. I was on Fox News, ABC, CNN, and I was featured on Jonathan Greenblatt's ADL program, Not My Campus, the initiative, and I also joined the special program on Fox Nation. This is not enough. I also was fortunate to have been able to attend the House Committee on Education and Workforce's hearing on anti-Semitism. So many of you may have seen the president of Columbia embarrass herself in front of the congressional committee. I was sitting right behind her. And I have to say, I was so embarrassed. It was terrible. I mean, I'm sitting there and she can't answer basic questions. At Columbia, the protests and encampments were situated right in the middle of campus. It was impossible to avoid them. I got calls from friends of mine in April saying, no, I can't get to class. I can't get through them. I'm terrified. They were unable to get to their classes, their exams, and the professors were not understanding at all. Professors even held classes in the encampment so that students who were in the encampment didn't need to leave. They could receive instruction from inside, and of course, none of us Jewish students were able to enter. It wasn't uncommon this year or last year for me to see someone from my class who I knew at a protest wearing a keffiyeh and raging against Israel. I was shocked and horrified at the stance they took against our people and our community. So many times I tried to interact with these so-called pro-Palestinian protesters, only to find that they had no idea what river and what sea they were talking about. It was as if the real facts and history of Israel just didn't matter to them. They couldn't see past the false propaganda that they had been fed. While I was in D.C. for the Jewish American Heritage Month, I had a private meeting with Speaker Johnson on the rapidly expanding anti-Semitism at Columbia University. Earlier that year, I and other brothers of the AEPI chapter at Columbia, we worked with the speaker's team to bring Speaker Johnson to campus. We brought him to our campus near the height of the encampment. And of course, he was booed and screamed at, but we stood behind him. The brothers of AEPI and other Jewish students stood behind him, and we stood in solidarity. And it was a signal to Jewish students that our concerns are being taken seriously at the highest level of government. We discussed how unprotected many Jewish students felt on campus and how unfortunate it was that Columbia had to shut down their in-person classes for the last 2 weeks of the semester, merely because the administration was unwilling to protect its Jewish students. In June, I was flown out to Israel to speak with Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Herzog about how Jewish students on college campuses can continue to help and support Israel, and how Israel can support us in our fight. Because this is important. Jewish students have been drawn into a proxy war on college campuses, and we don't have the proper tools to fight the accelerating anti-Semitism and false narratives that I am I'm committed to fighting this in any way that I can, but it's not enough. Anti-Semitism is a structural and institutional problem at the universities, and administrations have, in many cases, been paralyzed in their responses. In their attempt and fear of interfering with their students' historic right to protest, they have completely ignored the blatant anti-Semitism and Jew hatred in these demonstrations. At Columbia, for example, toward the end of the semester, they refused to take down the second encampment, opting instead to take classes online and telling Jewish students, just stay away. Instead of giving out consequences for violating New York City laws and university bylaws, they just told the Jewish students to stay away. This is how they protected us. The actions of many universities, and Columbia and Barnard in particular, rescinding or failing to implement suspensions for the students, faculty, and administration who were engaged in the hateful activities, even in the most severe cases, such as the takeover of Hamilton Hall, is concerning because it undermines any efforts to hold those accountable who have tried to intimidate Jewish students on campus. There's a valid concern that these protesters and their outside agitators are only going to be emboldened by their success and lack of meaningful consequences. I want accountability from the university. The university needs to act upon their promise that anti-Semitism will not be tolerated. Otherwise, their words are nothing but empty promises that send a sinister message to Jewish students, a message that we've been abandoned. I am often asked if I worry that speaking so vocally about campus anti-Semitism will attract further negative attention. Well, the answer is yes. While I certainly have no intention of making myself a target for the ire and hatred of the anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic protesters, for me, staying quiet was never an option. I feel that I have an obligation to live the Jewish values that I hold so dear. That means speaking out against evil and hatred wherever we see it. Listen, we all know that there's a war going on that started on October 7th in Israel, and it's now being fought on the battlefields of Gaza by the brave men and women of the IDF. But this is not the only war, and this is something that's important to recognize. There's another war going on. It's a proxy war. This proxy war began in the West years ago as the BDS movement, boycott, divest, sanction. And for the longest time, it has remained largely dormant. We've been lulled into a false sense of security. But on October 8th, it became something else, something much more dangerous and insidious. It started with Middle East professors labeling the terrorist attacks as justified resistance. Professors outright told students at these universities that rape is resistance. I mean, we watched as the president of Harvard said that it depends on the context. There is no context that can justify this. Numb with grief and still in shock from the horrific attack on Israel, American Jewish students were unprepared to respond to what we now know was a well-organized, well-planned, and well-funded multi-pronged anti-Israel propaganda campaign to destabilize political and financial support for Israel in the West. Almost a year and a half into fighting, and we're still unprepared. We are on the front lines of the battle of this proxy war, and we're losing. Our voices that are calling out for the release of the hostages are being drowned out by an overwhelming chorus of voices calling for a ceasefire that has become not just anti-Zionist, but in many cases blatantly anti-Semitic. Calling for a ceasefire without also calling for an unconditional release of all hostages is anti-Semitic. To turn the tide at Columbia and at other universities, we must get organized. I'm committed to working tirelessly, and so are many of my peers, to ensure that the narrative isn't stolen by those who hate us. Actually, I was just reading just now when we were listening to the beautiful services, I read a quote in the Siddur that talked about how Jews don't know despair. We don't know despair. We do what is right, and we continue in the face of the most challenging and the most violent enemies. We continue. We don't know despair. We don't give up. However, my advocacy extends many different ways. We talked about how I work with Robert Kraft, but I want to tell you about some of the other initiatives that I'm involved in and how those are being effective on Columbia's campus and on other universities. So, for example, with the AEPI Foundation, AEPI's Anti-Semitism Response Center, otherwise known as ARC, is an initiative that is vital because its support and resources are for students who are facing anti-Semitism on campuses nationwide. Through ARC, we're building a network of allies committed to combating hate and ensuring Jewish students feel safe and empowered. It's important that we can no longer simply afford to react, we have to be proactive. We need to arm students with the knowledge and tools they need to become advocates, not just for Israel, but for themselves. My sister is a senior in high school, and she was applying to colleges in the first part of this year, and a few months ago she called me, and in addition to having to worry about, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the SATs, the ACTs, GPA, everything, she called me and she asked me if she'll be safe because of her Judaism at the university she's applying to. And it broke my heart when my little sister asked me if she would be safe. And she told me she wanted nothing more than to come. She wanted to go to Barnard. She wanted to be with me. And she said she was scared that she wouldn't be safe there after seeing what happened to me when I spoke out for what I believe in. We need to arm students with the knowledge and tools they need to become advocates. Empowered and well-prepared, they can counter the hate and bring the truth to the forefront of Columbia and beyond. This fight is about more than just politics, it's about survival. It's not an issue of left versus right. It's an issue, it's just the right thing to do. The last thing I'll say is this: consider what fuels their disdain for Israel. They detest that Israel is a democracy. They despise its embodiment of Western values. This hostility extends beyond the mere anti-Israel and anti-Semitic sentiments. It's fundamentally anti-American. I witnessed these students openly calling for the downfall of America, demonstrating how deeply their ideologies clash with the principles of freedom and democracy. They had, on Veterans Day, a ceremony at Columbia. They called it Martyrs' Day. I mean, really, honestly, when I was meeting with Bibi, he made the comment that many of you may have seen, that Queers for Palestine is the same as chickens for KFC. And while it's sort of meant, and it listed sort of it's a humorous thing, really, after considering that some more, I feel bad for the cognitive dissonance that these people must have to be able to walk around campus carrying Hamas flags and Hezbollah flags and yet preach the very values that these terrorists are seeking to destroy. Their success depends on our silence, though. So this is very bleak, and I know I said that a lot of how we're losing, but we're gaining ground. Their success really depends on our silence, our lack of knowledge, our fear of speaking out, and our hesitance to confront this bigotry head on. So let's not let them win. Let's champion the cause of truth in the face of overwhelming falsehoods and stand firm against anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred. Let us take action, speak out, and hold our institutions accountable. We need to ensure that the narrative of Jewish students, of Israel, and of truth itself is heard loud and clear. It is our responsibility, our duty, to defend the ideals of democracy, justice, and peace. Together, we can turn the tide in this battle. Together, we can ensure the truth prevails. Together, we can win. Shabbat Shalom, and thank you for your courage and support.